In the year 921 A.D., a man stood on the banks of the Volga River, watching something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His name was Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and scholar from Baghdad. He had traveled thousands of miles through deserts, mountains, and endless steppes on a mission for the Caliph. But nothing in his sophisticated world, not the courts of Baghdad, not the libraries of the Islamic Golden Age, not the traders from a dozen nations he'd encountered, could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. The Vikings had come to Russia. But these weren't the Vikings you think you know. These weren't the raiders who terrorized European monasteries or the explorers who discovered Iceland and Greenland. These were the Swedish Vikings who had penetrated deep into the heart of Eastern Europe, who had built fortresses along the great rivers, who had mingled with Slavic peoples and created something entirely new, something dangerous, something that would change the course of history. And in 10 days' time, Ibn Fadlan would document a ritual so shocking, so brutal, so meticulously choreographed that historians still debate its meaning nearly 1,100 years later. A ritual that involved not just death, but voluntary sacrifice. Not just burial, but burning. Not just mourning, but celebration mixed with horror. This is the story nobody knows. The story of how Viking justice and Viking death became woven into the very fabric of what would eventually become Russia. The story of the angel of death. To understand what Ibn Fadlan saw in 921 A.D., we need to go back to when the Vikings first looked east instead of west, back to when Swedish traders and warriors discovered that the rivers of Eastern Europe were highways to unimaginable wealth, while their Norwegian and Danish cousins were raiding England and France. The Swedish Vikings had found something better, a water route to the richest civilizations on earth. The Volga River could take them to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic Caliphate. The Dnieper River led to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, the wealthiest city in Christendom. But these rivers didn't flow through empty wilderness. They cut through lands inhabited by Slavic tribes, the ancestors of modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And when the Vikings arrived, something unprecedented happened. They didn't just raid and leave. They stayed. They built fortified trading posts. They married Slavic women. They hired Slavic warriors. They created hybrid communities where Norse and Slavic cultures collided, merged, and created something new. The Slavs called them Rus, a name whose origin is still debated. Some say it comes from the Finnish word for Sweden, ruotsi. Others claim it derives from the Old Norse word for rowing. Regardless, this name Rus would eventually give birth to the word Russia itself. But the Rus brought more than trade goods and fortifications. They brought their laws, their customs, their brutal sense of justice, and their very specific ideas about death. In Scandinavian society, death wasn't a private affair. It was a public spectacle. A great chieftain's funeral was a demonstration of wealth, power, and cosmic belief. The dead were sent to the afterlife with everything they might need: weapons, food, horses, and sometimes companions, human companions. The Rus had established numerous settlements along the Volga by the early 10th century. The largest was Bulgar, the capital of the Volga-Bulgaria state, a wealthy trading hub where Arabic silver flowed north and furs, amber, and slaves flowed south. It was to this region that Ibn Fadlan was sent in 921 A.D. Ahmad Ibn Fadlan was no ordinary traveler. He was a faqih, an Islamic legal scholar. chosen personally by the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir to serve on a diplomatic mission. The king of Volga, Bulgaria, had converted to Islam and requested help from Baghdad teachers to instruct his people in the faith, funds to build a fortress against hostile neighbors, and the prestige of formal recognition from the caliph. Ibn Fadlan's journey from Baghdad began in June 921 A.D. He traveled through Persia, across the harsh deserts of Central Asia, skirted the Aral Sea, and finally reached the Volga River after months of hardship. His written account, known as the Risala, provides one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of the Viking Rus we possess. But Ibn Fadlan was a man of the Islamic Golden Age, from a civilization that prized cleanliness, learning, and refined manners. The Rus he encountered were his cultural opposite, and he didn't hide his disgust. I have never seen people of more perfect physique. They are tall as date palms and reddish in color. They wear neither coat nor kaftan, but each man carries a cape which covers one half of his body, leaving one hand free. Each man has an axe, a sword, and a knife, and never parts from any of these. But they are the filthiest of God's creatures. They do not wash after urinating or defecating or after sexual relations. They do not wash their hands after meals. They are like wandering donkeys. Ibn Fadlan's account reveals a man caught between fascination and revulsion. The Rus were impressive warriors, shrewd traders, and commanded respect, even fear, from surrounding peoples. But their hygiene practices, their pagan rituals, and their casual relationship with violence shocked the sophisticated Arab scholar. Yet it was their approach to death and to justice that would truly horrify him. The Rus had brought with them a legal system from Scandinavia, but it had evolved in the harsh environment of Eastern Europe. It was a system where honor meant everything, where insults could only be washed away with blood, where theft was punished with mutilation or death, and where the community witnessed every execution. There were no prisons in Rus society, no rehabilitation, no appeals. Justice was swift, public, and brutal. An accused person faced the assembly, the thing where free men decided guilt or innocence. But once guilt was established, the punishments were immediate and severe. For theft, a hand might be taken. For murder, the murderer might be executed or forced to pay wurgled blood money to the victim's family. For treason or oath-breaking, death was certain. And death among the Rus was never quiet or hidden. It was a message to the living. But individual executions were nothing compared to what happened when a great chieftain died. In the autumn of 921 A.D., shortly after Ibn Fadlan arrived in the region, a Rus chieftain died. Not just any chieftain, but a wealthy and powerful lord who commanded ships, warriors, and vast quantities of trade goods. His death would require a funeral befitting his status, a funeral that would last 10 days, a funeral that would require a volunteer, a funeral that would leave Ibn Fadlan so disturbed that he documented every detail with the precision of a man who couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ibn Fadlan had no way of knowing that what he was about to witness would become one of the most important historical documents ever written, that scholars would pore over his words for centuries, trying to understand the minds of the people who conducted this ritual, that his account would provide crucial evidence for understanding how Viking customs influenced the development of law, justice, and the very concept of state power in early Russia. He only knew that he was about to see something terrible, something that would challenge everything he believed about civilization, about humanity, about the line between honor and horror. The chieftain's body had been placed in a temporary grave. The preparations had begun. Somewhere in the Rus camp, a slave girl was being asked a question that would seal her fate. Who among you will die with him? Her name has been lost to history. We don't know if she was Slavic or from some other conquered people. We don't know how old she was, though Ibn Fadlan's account suggests she was young. We don't know how long she had been a slave to the Rus, or what dreams she might have had before that day. We only know that when the question was asked, "Who among you will die with him?" she said yes, and with that single word she became central to one of the most documented and controversial death rituals in Viking history. She became the companion who would follow her master into the afterlife. She became a sacrifice. She became what the Rus called her in those final 10 days, a woman who would enter paradise. But before we continue her story, we need to understand something crucial, something that Ibn Fadlan himself struggled to comprehend. In the world of the Viking Rus, she wasn't being murdered, at least not in their eyes. She was fulfilling a sacred role. She was performing a duty that would earn her honor, status, and according to their beliefs, eternal reward. To us, separated by more than a millennium and countless cultural revolutions, this seems impossible to accept. But to understand how Viking customs shaped Russian concepts of justice and death, how they created a culture where state power over life and death became absolute, we must enter the mindset of the Rus, no matter how dark that journey becomes. The moment the slave girl volunteered, her status changed completely. Ibn Fadlan noted this transformation with the careful eye of an anthropologist, centuries before anthropology existed as a discipline. She was no longer a slave. She was placed under the care of 2 other slave women who would attend to her every need for the next 10 days. She was given the chieftain's alcohol to drink, and Ibn Fadlan notes that she drank heavily and constantly, singing and appearing joyful. She was dressed in fine clothes. She was treated with a respect that shocked the Arab observer. But why? Why this transformation? Why treat a sacrificial victim like an honored guest? The answer lies in Viking cosmology and their understanding of the afterlife. The Norse believed that death was not an ending, but a transition. The soul traveled to different realms depending on how one died. Warriors who fell in battle went to Valhalla or Folkvanger, the halls of the gods, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Those who died of old age or illness went to hell, a shadowy realm that was neither punishment nor reward. But a chieftain, a powerful lord, needed to maintain his status in the afterlife. He needed his weapons, his wealth, his horses, and his retinue. Just as a king in life had servants, guards, and companions, so too would he need them in death. The slave girl who volunteered wasn't being killed. She was being elevated. She was being transformed from property into a person of significance. She would enter the afterlife as a free woman, as a companion to a lord, guaranteed a place in the feasting halls. Or so they told her, and perhaps in those 10 days of drinking and celebration, she believed it. But here's where the story becomes more complex, more troubling. Because Ibn Fadlan, with his outsider's perspective, noticed something that the Rus themselves might not have acknowledged. The girl drank constantly, not in moderation, not socially, but to the point of intoxication every single day. The 2 women attending her kept her supplied with alcohol. She sang, she appeared joyful, but was it genuine joy? Or was it the euphoria of someone being kept in an altered state specifically so she wouldn't change her mind? Modern scholars debate this intensely. Some argue that human sacrifice among the Vikings was voluntary and honored, that people genuinely believed they were gaining eternal reward. Others suggest that social pressure, religious indoctrination, and substances like alcohol created an environment where voluntary is a questionable term. There's another possibility that historians whisper about, but rarely state directly, that the girl couldn't change her mind even if she wanted to. That once someone volunteered for this role, they were committed. That voluntary sacrifice was voluntary only in that initial moment of saying yes. What we do know is this: for 10 days preparations continued, and the girl was central to a specific ritual that Ibn Fadlan found particularly disturbing. Each day she would visit the tents of different Rus men, important men, leaders, warriors, and each man would have sexual relations with her, saying afterward, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." Ibn Fadlan's shock at this practice is evident in his writing. To his Islamic sensibilities, this was debauchery, a violation of every standard of decency. But to the Rus, it was something else entirely, a ritual binding the community to the dead chieftain, a symbolic sharing of life force with someone who would soon enter the realm of the dead. It was also unmistakably an assertion of power, a demonstration that the body of a slave, even one elevated for sacrifice, belonged to the community, to be used as the ritual required. This is where we begin to see how Viking customs shaped Russian concepts of power, death, and justice. The state represented by the community, by the chieftain, by the collective of free men, had absolute authority over life and death. Individual will mattered only insofar as it aligned with communal needs and ritual requirements. While the girl performed her ritual visits, the dead chieftain's body lay in its temporary grave, and preparations for the final ceremony continued. A ship was dragged onto the shore, not just any ship, but the chieftain's own vessel, the symbol of his power and mobility. Around it, elaborate preparations began. The Rus built a large wooden structure on the ship's deck, essentially a house on a boat. Inside this structure, they placed a bench covered with Byzantine silk cushions and quilts. This would be the chieftain's final resting place. They selected horses to be sacrificed, several of them, and divided their meat. Some would be thrown onto the ship as provisions for the afterlife. They brought dogs, chickens, and a cow, all destined for sacrifice. They gathered the chieftain's weapons, his armor, his clothing, his wealth, and they sent for the angel of death. Ibn Fadlan describes her simply as an old woman, whom they call the angel of death. In the original Arabic, the term suggests someone who presides over death, someone with ritual authority. She wasn't called this as a euphemism or a metaphor. This was her actual title, her role in Rus society. Think about that for a moment. These Viking communities that had settled along the Volga had a permanent official position for someone who specialized in death rituals, someone who knew the prayers, the sequences, the exact method of killing required for the sacrifice to be acceptable to the gods. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't mob justice. This was systematized, ritualized, professionalized death. And it's here that we see the seeds of what would eventually become the Russian state's monopoly on capital punishment. Who was this angel of death? Was she a priestess? A Volva, a Norse seeress and practitioner of magic? A woman who had performed this ritual so many times that she had become the community's specialist. Ibn Fadlan notes that she was old, which suggests experience, authority accumulated over decades. He also notes that she had daughters who assisted her, suggesting this might have been a position passed down through families, a hereditary role in death. The angel of death arrived at the burial site and immediately took charge. She directed the placement of objects on the ship. She oversaw the sacrifice of the animals. She supervised the removal of the chieftain's body from its temporary grave and its preparation for the final ceremony. And she prepared the instruments she would need for the girl, a cord, a knife, and knowledge of exactly how to use them. On the 10th day, everything was ready. The ship sat on the shore, laden with goods, surrounded by the Rus community. The chieftain's body had been dressed in fine clothes trousers, boots, a caftan of silk and gold buttons. Ibn Fadlan notes that despite 10 days passing, the body hadn't decomposed significantly, which the Rus attributed to the cold. The girl was brought to the ship. She was still drinking, still singing, but now there was a frantic quality to it. Ibn Fadlan describes her going to different family groups, and at each one, a family member would give her more alcohol and sing with her. Was she celebrating? Or was she being kept intoxicated for what was about to happen? The morning ritual began. The girl was lifted up 3 times to look over a wooden frame, perhaps a door frame or a ritual structure. The first time she said she saw her dead parents. The second time she saw all her dead relatives sitting together. The third time she saw her master in paradise, and he was calling to her, telling her to come to him. This ritual, scholars believe, was designed to reinforce her belief in the afterlife, to make the spiritual world feel real and immediate, to strengthen her resolve for what came next. Because what came next would require resolve, or unconsciousness, or both. The girl was led onto the ship. 6 men entered with her close relatives of the dead chieftain, Ibn Fadlan specifies. They went into the wooden structure where the chieftain's body lay on the bench. And here, Ibn Fadlan's account becomes explicit in a way that has disturbed readers for 1,000 years. Because what happened next wasn't a quick death. It wasn't a merciful ending. It was a choreographed ritual that involved multiple people, specific actions, and a level of violence that shocked even the Arab scholar who had witnessed executions in Baghdad. The girl lay down beside the dead chieftain. 2 men held her feet. 2 men held her hands. The angel of death wrapped the cord around her neck, giving the ends to 2 more men who would pull from opposite sides. And then the angel of death took her knife. We will not describe in detail what Ibn Fadlan described, but we need to understand that the girl died from a combination of strangulation and stabbing, a method that was deliberate, ritual, and according to the Rus, necessary. The men on shore beat their shields with sticks, making an enormous noise. Why? Ibn Fadlan was told it was so the other slave girls wouldn't hear the screams and become afraid, making them unwilling to volunteer for future sacrifices. Think about the implications of that explanation. It assumes there will be future sacrifices. It assumes there will be other girls who will face the same choice. It treats this not as an exceptional event, but as a regular practice that must be carefully managed to ensure continuation. This was systematized death. This was a culture that had normalized human sacrifice to the point of worrying about public relations problems. When it was done, when the girl's body lay beside her master's, The naked kinsman, a male relative of the chieftain who performed the final ritual, nude-backed. Out of the structure and set it alight. The community piled wood around the ship. Within an hour, Ibn Fadlan reports, everything was consumed by flames, ship, structure, bodies, goods, animals, all reduced to ash. The next day, the Rus built a circular mound over the ashes and erected a wooden post inscribed with the chieftain's name and the name of the Rus king. And then life continued. Trade resumed. The river flowed. The girl whose name we don't know became smoke and memory and a paragraph in a medieval Arabic manuscript. But her death and the system that required it would echo through history in ways no one that day could have imagined. What Ibn Fadlan witnessed on the Volga in 921 A.D. wasn't random brutality. It wasn't chaos or barbarism in the sense of lawlessness. It was something far more significant and, in many ways, more disturbing. It was order, systematic order. A death ritual so carefully choreographed, so meticulously executed, with such clear rules and roles, that it revealed a society with very specific ideas about power, law, and the state's authority over human life. And these ideas carried by the Viking Rus along the river routes of Eastern Europe would become woven into the very foundation of what we now call Russia. They would influence how Slavic peoples thought about justice, about punishment, about the relationship between the individual and the state. To understand this transformation, we need to explore something that historians call the architecture of fear, ways societies construct systems of punishment not just to stop crime, but to display power, maintain hierarchy, and enforce social order through spectacular demonstrations of state authority. The Vikings were masters of this architecture, and they brought their blueprint to Russia. Let's start with a fundamental question. What is a legal system? At its most basic, law is an agreement about how a community will handle disputes and punish wrongdoing. But law is also always about power, about who has the authority to judge, who has the authority to punish, and how that authority is displayed and enforced. In the Viking world, law wasn't written in books. It was memorized, recited at assemblies, and evolved through tradition and consensus. The wing, the assembly of free men, was where disputes were heard, where accusations were made, where guilt or innocence was determined. But the wing wasn't a court in the modern sense. It wasn't about discovering truth or ensuring justice. It was about maintaining social peace and displaying community power. The goal wasn't rehabilitation of criminals. It was removal of threats and assertion of hierarchy. And when it came to serious crimes, murder, treason, oath-breaking, violations of sacred law, the punishment was death. Public death. Death that sent a message? The Rus who settled along the Volga, Dnieper, and other Eastern European rivers brought these legal concepts with them. But they also had to adapt to their new environment. They were a minority, powerful, well-armed, and controlling key trade routes, but still vastly outnumbered by the Slavic populations around them. They needed to establish authority not just through military force, but through psychological dominance. They needed their subject peoples to internalize the idea that Rus power was absolute, unchallengeable, sanctioned by gods and nature itself. How do you make people believe in your absolute authority? You demonstrate it, publicly, repeatedly, with carefully orchestrated displays that mix fear with awe, that make power visible and undeniable. The funeral Ibn Fadlan witnessed was one such display, but there were others. Arabic sources from the 9th and 10th centuries merchants and travelers who encountered the Rus describe a people obsessed with honor and reputation. An insult to a Rus warrior couldn't be ignored or forgiven. It had to be answered with violence. If a Rus man was insulted and didn't respond, he lost status. If he responded with words rather than action, he was mocked. The only acceptable response to an affront to honor was blood. This wasn't just cultural preference. It was strategic. In a world where the Rus were minorities controlling trade routes through potentially hostile territory, they couldn't afford to show weakness. Every slight had to be answered with overwhelming force. Every challenge had to end with the challenger's death or complete submission. This culture of violent honor enforcement became one of the foundation stones of early Russian legal culture. The idea that certain offenses are so serious they can only be answered with death, that some crimes strike at the very heart of social order and therefore require the ultimate punishment. This idea came from the Vikings. Let's look at specific examples of how Viking legal concepts manifested in early Rus society and eventually influenced Russian law. The concept of bloodweed wurgeld in Anglo-Saxon England, wurgeld among the continental Germanic peoples, and eret among the Rus. This was blood money, a payment system where a murderer could avoid execution by paying the victim's family a set amount based on the victim's social status. But here's the crucial detail. The amount wasn't negotiable. It was fixed by law and tradition. A nobleman was worth more than a freeman, who was worth more than a slave. Your value as a human being was literally quantified and written into law. The Rus brought this system to Eastern Europe, and it became embedded in early Slavic legal codes. The Ruskaya Pravda, the first written legal code of Kievan Rus, compiled in the 11th century, contains detailed schedules of wurgeld payments. Kill a nobleman? Pay this amount. Kill a commoner? Pay that amount. Kill a slave? Pay the owner for property damage. But the same legal code also specifies crimes for which wurgeld wasn't enough. Crimes that required death. Treason. Oath-breaking. Killing a lord or prince. Certain forms of theft, especially horse theft, which was considered so serious because horses were crucial for warfare and survival. And any crime committed by someone who had already been caught and punished once, recidivism, was itself a death penalty offense. The Ruskaya Pravda is fascinating because we can see Viking concepts being adapted and systematized. It's written in Old East Slavic, not Old Norse, but the legal thinking behind it is heavily influenced by Viking traditions. For instance, the concept of going outside the law being declared an outlaw. In Viking society, an outlaw was someone who had committed such serious crimes that they were expelled from society's protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty. They were literally outside the law's protection. This concept appears in early Rus legal codes. A person could be declared wolf's head, meaning they were like a dangerous wolf that anyone could hunt. This wasn't just a death sentence. It was a death sentence that made the entire community complicit. It made killing the outlaw a civic duty. Think about the psychology of this. You're not just punishing one person. You're forcing the entire community to accept that this person deserves it, that killing them is righteous. You're building a collective mindset where state violence is normalized, where the authority to kill becomes distributed throughout society. But there's something even more significant happening here, something that helps explain why Russia would eventually develop one of the most extensive and brutal systems of capital punishment in European history. The Viking Rus were creating what sociologists call state monopoly on legitimate violence. In modern democracies, we take for granted that only the state can legally use force police, military, courts. But this wasn't always the case. In many medieval societies, justice was decentralized. Families or local lords handled most disputes. The king or central authority only got involved in major cases. The Rus were different. They were creating centralized trading networks that required strong central authority. They needed to establish that the prince, the ruler, had ultimate authority over life and death within his territory. And they did this by making death a public spectacle. When the Rus executed someone for a serious crime, it wasn't done quietly. It was a ceremony. The condemned person was brought before the community. Their crimes were recited. The sentence was pronounced. And then the execution was carried out in a way that maximized visibility and psychological impact. Ibn Fadlan mentions seeing Rus criminals executed by methods that included hanging, beheading, and being thrown bound into the river. But what struck him wasn't just the methods. It was that these executions were public performances with audiences. The community gathered. They watched. They were meant to feel fear, yes, but also something else. The comfort of knowing they were on the right side of power, that they were part of the community that did the judging rather than the outsiders who were judged. This is the architecture of fear. You build a system where punishment is public. Everyone must witness. Ritualized, performed the same way each time, giving it the weight of tradition. Extreme, severe enough to be memorable, sanctioned by higher authority, whether gods, the Thing Assembly, or the Prince, and most crucially, unavoidable once triggered now. Here's where the story gets more complex and connects directly to what would become Russian legal culture. The Rus didn't just impose their legal system on conquered Slavic peoples. They merged with them. Viking warriors took Slavic wives. Slavic warriors joined Rus armies. The ruling class became a hybrid Norse-Slavic elite. And the legal systems merged too. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the principalities of Kievan Rus were no longer purely Viking or purely Slavic. They were something new, a fusion culture. And the legal system that emerged reflected both traditions. From the Slavs came certain communal justice traditions, concepts of collective responsibility, and Byzantine Christian influences after Vladimir. I converted in 988 A.D. From the Vikings came the emphasis on public execution, the codification of crimes deserving death, and the idea that the prince had ultimate authority over life and death. But here's the fascinating historical irony. Christianity complicated everything. When Vladimir I converted Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity in 988 A.D., he faced a dilemma. The church taught that all life was sacred, that execution was a sin, that even criminals should be given a chance for repentance and redemption. For a time, a brief, historically unique moment, Kievan Rus actually reduced capital punishment. Vladimir tried to replace executions with fines, imprisonment, or exile. The church pushed for mercy, for Christian charity. It didn't last. The boyars, the noble class, descended from both Viking jarls and Slavic chief, demanded the return of capital punishment. They argued that without the fear of death, crime would spiral out of control, that enemies would see mercy as weakness, that the authority of the prince would be undermined. And so, by the 11th century, capital punishment returned. But now it came with an ideological justification that combined Viking concepts of honor and social order with Byzantine Christian concepts of divine authority and just rulership. The prince wasn't just a powerful warlord. He was God's appointed representative on earth. His authority to execute criminals came not just from military might, but from divine sanction. This made state violence not just legal, but holy. This is the ideological foundation that would persist in Russia for centuries. The idea that the ruler's power over life and death comes from God, that resistance to state authority is not just illegal, but sinful, that execution is not murder, but divine justice administered through human hands. The architecture of fear that the Viking Rus built along the rivers of Eastern Europe wasn't made of stone and timber. It was made of ideas, the idea that some crimes are so severe they can only be answered with death. The idea that punishment must be public, must be visible, must teach the community what happens to those who violate sacred law. The idea that the state, whether led by a Viking chieftain, a Rus prince, or eventually a Russian Tsar, has absolute authority over life and death. And perhaps most significantly, the idea that this authority is not just practical but spiritual, not just legal but cosmic, woven into the very fabric of how the universe operates. These ideas didn't die with the Vikings. They evolved. They adapted to changing circumstances, to new religions, to different political systems. But the core remained. The Russian state's claim to absolute authority over life and death, justified by tradition, sanctified by religion, and enforced through spectacular displays of violence. By the time of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, Russian executions had become elaborate public spectacles. Condemned men were boiled alive, impaled, roasted on spits, broken on the wheel all in front of massive crowds in Moscow's Red Square. By the time of the Romanov dynasty, there were dozens of crimes punishable by death, and executions were regular public events that drew thousands of spectators. By the Soviet era, Stalin's purges would execute hundreds of thousands, and while these killings were often done secretly, the fear they generated was entirely public, a fear that kept an empire under control. The methods changed. The justifications changed. But the underlying principle that the state has the absolute right to kill those it deems threats to social order remained constant. And it started on the banks of the Volga River, where a Viking chieftain was burned on his ship, where a slave girl died believing she was entering paradise, where an Arab scholar wrote down what he saw with shaking hands. It started with the Rus, with the Vikings who created Russia. Close your eyes and imagine her face. The angel of death standing beside a burning ship on the Volga River, watching the flames consume the bodies of a chieftain and a slave girl. Smoke rises into the gray autumn sky. The smell of burning flesh, human and animal, drifts across the water. She's old, Ibn Fadlan tells us. Her face marked by years, by the weight of how many such rituals. How many times had she wrapped the cord around a girl's neck? How many times had she driven the knife home while men pulled the cord tight? How many women had looked into her eyes in those final moments, seeking reassurance, seeking mercy, seeking anything to hold on to as consciousness faded? We don't know her name. We don't know if she believed in the God she served, or if she'd become cynical after years of performing the same choreographed murder. We don't know if she slept soundly after such days, or if the ghosts of the girls haunted her dreams. But we know her legacy, because the angel of death wasn't just one woman. She was a position, a role, a function within Rus society. And that function, the professional administrator of ritualized death, would evolve and persist in Russian culture for 1,000 years. This is the story of how ritual executioners became state executioners and how the death penalty became institutionalized in Russia. To understand the Angel of Death's legacy, we need to ask a question that might seem strange. What's the difference between murder and execution? On the surface, both involve one person killing another. Both end a human life. Both cause suffering to the victim and grief to those who love them. So what makes execution different? What transforms killing from crime to justice? The answer is ritual. Ritual transforms violence into law. When the angel of death killed the slave girl, she wasn't committing murder in the eyes of Rus society. She was performing a sacred duty. The killing was sanctioned by tradition, by religious belief, by community consensus. It followed specific steps in a specific order for specific purposes. And crucially, she was designated to do it. Not just anyone could perform this ritual. It required someone with knowledge, with authority, with the community's trust that they would do it correctly. This is where professional executioners come from. And the Rus had them first in Eastern Europe. As Kievan Rus developed from scattered Viking trading posts into a unified state in the 10th and 11th centuries, the administration of justice became more formalized. The prince's druzhina, his retinue of professional warriors, began to include men whose job was specifically to carry out executions and corporal punishment. These weren't random soldiers assigned to a distasteful task. They were specialists, men who knew how to kill efficiently, how to carry out the specific punishments prescribed by law: beheading for some crimes, hanging for others, drowning or burning for still others. And just like the angel of death, they operated within a system of rules. They couldn't kill whoever they wanted. They only executed those condemned by proper legal process, by the prince's court or the vetch, the assembly of citizens in free cities like Novgorod. This professionalization of death was crucial. It meant that execution wasn't an act of passion or revenge. It was a bureaucratic function. You could have a career as an executioner, just as you could have a career as a blacksmith or a baker. And that transformation from religious ritual specialist to state functionary is how the angel of death's legacy manifested in Russian legal culture. Let's trace this evolution through specific historical moments. In the 12th century, during the height of Kievan Rus's power, the chronicle records that the city of Novgorod had a specific location for executions, a bridge over the Volga River. Condemned criminals were brought before the vetch, judged, and if found guilty of serious crimes, they were either thrown from the bridge or hanged from it. But here's the detail that matters. Specific men were assigned this duty. It wasn't mob violence. It was organized. The men who carried out executions were paid from the city treasury. It was a job. By the 13th century, when the Mongol invasion devastated Kievan Rus and scattered its principalities, each regional prince maintained executioners as part of their court. When Moscow began its rise to dominance in the 14th century, the Grand Princes of Moscow had official executioners who accompanied the court, who had specific regalia and tools of office. And by the time of Ivan III in the late 15th century, the role had become thoroughly institutionalized. The executioner wore a specific uniform, typically a red kaftan, and carried specific tools. The execution platform in Moscow's Red Square was a permanent structure. Executions were scheduled, announced, and performed according to strict protocol. Imagine being an executioner in 15th century Moscow. What would your life be like? You'd be both feared and needed. People would avoid you on the street, wouldn't want you in their homes, wouldn't let their daughters marry you. Executioners and their families often lived in segregated communities, marked by their profession just as surely as if they wore a brand. But you'd also have job security. The state needed you. You'd be paid regularly from the treasury. You'd have legal protections. Assaulting an executioner was itself a serious crime because you represented the prince's authority. You'd need to maintain your tools meticulously. Axes had to be kept sharp. A dull axe meant suffering for the condemned and embarrassment for you. Ropes had to be strong and the knots tied precisely. The fire pit had to be prepared correctly for those condemned to burn. And you'd need to know not just how to kill, but how to kill in specific ways for specific crimes. Russian legal codes became increasingly detailed about execution methods. Traitors were often drawn and quartered. Counterfeiters might be executed by pouring molten metal down their throats. Murderers were beheaded. Some crimes called for breaking on the wheel, being tied to a wagon wheel and having bones systematically broken with a hammer. Others required impalement, drowning, or being buried alive. Each method had ritual significance. Each sent a specific message about the nature of the crime and the power of the state. And then came Ivan, the fourth Ivan the Terrible, and everything escalated. Ivan the Terrible's reign from 1547 to 1584 represents perhaps the fullest flowering of the tradition that began with the Viking Rus. Public execution became not just justice but theater, not just punishment but spectacle, not just death but demonstration of absolute power. Ivan maintained a corps of executioners and torturers as part of his oprichnina, his personal security force. These men didn't just carry out executions. They invented new methods. They competed to devise the most creative punishments. They made death into a dark art. The chronicles describe executions where victims were roasted alive on slowly turning spits, where people were sewn into bearskins and hunted by dogs, where entire families were executed together in elaborate ritual murders designed to maximize suffering and terror. And all of this was done publicly in Moscow's Red Square, before crowds numbering in the thousands. Why? Why this escalation into theatrical cruelty? Because Ivan understood something fundamental about power. Fear is most effective when it's mixed with awe. When executions become so elaborate, so imaginative, so far beyond normal human experience that people can't look away, can't stop talking about it, can't escape the psychological impact. Ivan was using the same principle the Viking Rus understood when they burned their chieftain on a ship with a sacrificed slave girl. Make death memorable, make it ritualized, make it spectacular, and in doing so, make the state's power feel overwhelming, divine, inevitable. But Ivan added something new. He made execution personal. He often attended executions personally, sometimes participating in the torture. He made people understand that death came not from an impersonal legal system, but from the Tsar himself, from God's appointed ruler, from someone who had the divine right to snuff out life on a whim. This was the angel of death's legacy reaching its apotheosis. The ritual specialist who killed according to cosmic law had become the Tsar's personal executioner, carrying out the divine will of an autocrat. The tradition continued through the time of troubles, through the Romanov dynasty, through Peter the Great, who famously beheaded his own son's conspirators personally, learning the executioner's trade and boasting of his skill with the axe. By the 18th century, Russia had the most extensive death penalty system in Europe. Elizabeth Petrovna briefly abolished capital punishment in 1744, the only Russian ruler to do so, but her successors quickly restored it. Catherine the Great, despite her Enlightenment pretensions, oversaw thousands of executions, and the professionalization continued. By the 19th century, Russian executioners were trained professionals who wrote manuals on technique. They had apprentices and assistants. They had guilds and a sense associations of executioners who shared knowledge and maintained standards. The last imperial executioner, a man who worked in the early 20th century, kept detailed records. He noted the names of those he executed, the crimes, the methods used, the time it took. His notes read like a craftsman's ledger, which in a sense they were. Then came the Soviet era, and you might think the tradition would end. The Bolsheviks claimed to be creating a new world, breaking with the past. Surely they would reject the death penalty as a tool of czarist oppression? They didn't. Instead, they expanded it. During the Great Terror under Stalin, executions reached industrial scale. The executioners weren't individual specialists anymore. They were NKVD officers who killed by quota, who processed victims like factory workers on an assembly line. But even in this modernized, bureaucratic form, echoes of the old tradition remained. Executions still carried ritual significance. They still served to demonstrate state power. They still mixed fear with awe of a state so powerful it could erase millions and make people complicit in their own terror, afraid to speak against what was happening because they might be next. The angel of death had become a bureaucracy, but the function, the use of ritualized death to maintain social control remained constant. So what is the angel of death's true legacy? It's not just the executioners themselves, though their tradition persisted for 1,000 years, from the old woman on the Volga to the NKVD officer in a Moscow basement. It's not just the death penalty itself, though Russia's relationship with capital punishment remains unique even today, having briefly abolished it after the Soviet Union's collapse, yet never ratifying the international protocols that would make that abolition permanent. The real legacy is something deeper. It's the idea that death can be administered by the state not as a regrettable necessity, but as a right, even a sacred duty. That there exists a category of people traitors, enemies, criminals, whose deaths are not just justified, but required for social order. It's the idea that the state can designate certain individuals to carry death on its behalf, and that those individuals are not murderers, but functionaries, not criminals, but civil servants. It's the idea that execution can be ritual, can carry meaning beyond mere punishment, can serve as theater and lesson and demonstration all at once. And perhaps most significantly, it's the idea that all of this is normal, that a society can exist where systematic killing is so institutionalized, so professionalized, so wrapped in tradition and law and bureaucracy, that it becomes simply another aspect of governance, like collecting taxes or maintaining roads. The angel of death stood on the Volga in 921 A.D., performing her ritual one more time. She had no way of knowing that what she did would echo through centuries, that her role would evolve into court executioners, into state terror, into bureaucratic murder, on an unimaginable scale. She was just doing her job, following the old ways, fulfilling the ritual requirements so the chieftain could enter the afterlife properly attended. But in doing so, she helped create a tradition, a way of thinking about death and power and the state's authority that would shape Russian history. The Vikings didn't just bring trade and warfare to Eastern Europe. They didn't just found cities and marry into Slavic families. They brought a specific understanding of how death could be used as a tool of social control, how ritual could transform murder into justice, how the systematic taking of life could become a pillar of state power. And that understanding, born on the rivers where Swedish Vikings met Slavic peoples, refined in the courts of Kiev and Rus, expanded by Tsars and Soviets, remains embedded in Russian political culture. The Angel of Death's work is never quite finished. Her legacy lives on in laws and traditions, in the architecture of fear that still shapes how states relate to citizens, in the persistent belief that some people deserve death and that the state has the right to provide it. And somewhere in the archives of history, written in Arabic by a shocked Islamic scholar, her story waits, waiting for us to finally understand what it meant, what it means, what it will always mean when power and death embrace. In November 1996, something extraordinary happened in Russia. The Russian government signed Protocol No. 6 to the European Convention on Human Rights, a document that abolished the death penalty in peacetime. Executions were suspended pending ratification. For the first time in over 1,000 years, since the Vikings first brought their concepts of ritualized death to the rivers of Eastern Europe, Russia moved toward a future without state-sanctioned killing. And then nothing. The protocol was never ratified. It sits in legal limbo, signed but not implemented, a promise unfulfilled. As of 2025, Russia maintains a moratorium on executions, but the death penalty remains on the books for certain crimes. The law still exists. The tradition persists. The architecture of fear, built by the Viking Rus and maintained for a millennium, stands empty but not demolished. Why? Why can't Russia let go of the death penalty, even as nearly every other European nation has abolished it entirely? The answer takes us back to where we started, to that Volga River bank in 921 A.D., to the burning ship, to the angel of death and the slave girl whose name we'll never know. Because what happened that day wasn't just about one execution. It was about creating a template, a pattern of thinking about power and death that became so deeply embedded in Russian political culture that it persists even when the practical need for it has vanished. This is the story of how history haunts the present, how the past refuses to let go, how the Vikings created more than Russia. They created a relationship between the Russian state and death that defines the country even now. Let's start with a paradox. Russia, in many ways, has been at the forefront of legal reform and progressive thought throughout its history. In 1864, Tsar Alexander II enacted judicial reforms that created one of the most modern court systems in Europe: trial by jury, public trials, independent judges. In 1917, the Bolsheviks claimed to be creating a workers' paradise where the state would eventually wither away. In 1996, as we mentioned, Russia signed the protocol abolishing the death penalty. Yet, despite these moments of reform, of reaching toward enlightened values, Russia repeatedly returns to the same fundamental principles established by the Viking Rus: the state's absolute authority over life and death, the use of spectacular punishment to maintain order, the belief that certain crimes can only be answered with the ultimate penalty. Why does this pattern persist? Historians and political scientists have debated this question for decades. Some argue it's about geography, that Russia's vast size, harsh climate, and vulnerable borders created a perpetual state of emergency where strong centralized authority, backed by the threat of death, was necessary for survival. Others point to religion, that Orthodox Christianity's emphasis on authority, suffering, and mystical connection between the ruler and the divine created an ideological foundation for autocracy. Still others argue it's about developmental path that Russia never experienced a gradual evolution toward constitutional government that occurred in Western Europe, instead lurching between autocracy and revolution without the stabilizing middle ground of reform. All of these explanations have merit, but they miss something crucial, something that connects directly to what Ibn Fadlan witnessed on the Volga. The Viking Rus didn't just bring a legal system to Eastern Europe. They brought a mentality, a way of understanding the relationship between the individual and the collective, between power and obedience, between life and death. In Viking society and in the Rus society that evolved from it, the individual existed primarily as part of the collective. Your value came from your place in the social hierarchy. Your rights came from your status, and your life belonged to the community in a very literal sense. When the slave girl volunteered to die with her master, she wasn't making a purely individual choice. She was fulfilling a social role. The community expected it. The religion demanded it. The entire structure of her world pushed her toward that decision, and when the angel of death killed her, she wasn't committing murder. She was acting as the community's instrument, carrying out a collective will, performing a function that society required. This is fundamentally different from the Western European tradition that evolved from Roman law and Enlightenment philosophy, the tradition that emphasizes individual rights, that sees humans as autonomous beings with inherent dignity, that places limits on state power specifically to protect individuals from collective demands. The Viking Rus tradition emphasized the opposite. The individual subordination to the collective, the state's absolute authority as representative of that collective, and the idea that death could be demanded when the collective required it. And this mentality, this fundamental way of thinking about individuals and power became embedded in Russian political culture. Look at how this plays out in Russian history, again and again. Even the terrible didn't just execute conspirators. He executed anyone he suspected of insufficient loyalty. The accusation itself was enough. The state's need for absolute obedience overrode any individual's right to life. Peter the Great personally tortured and executed the Streltsy rebels, displaying their corpses around Moscow for months. Why? Not just to punish rebellion, but to demonstrate that even ancient military traditions, even groups that had served Russia for generations, had no rights against the state's will. Stalin's purges operated on the same principle. You could be executed not for what you did, but for who you were, for your class background, for your potential to oppose the collective. Individual guilt or innocence was irrelevant. The state's need for control was paramount. And today, modern Russia may not execute people anymore, but the mentality persists. Political opponents experience mysterious accidents, poisonings, falls from windows. Journalists investigating state corruption disappear. The methods are different, more deniable, but the underlying principle is the same. The state's needs override individual rights to life. But here's the truly disturbing part. This isn't just about Russia. The Viking legacy, the architecture of fear that the Rus built, reveals something universal about how states use death as a tool of control. Every society that has maintained capital punishment for extended periods develops similar patterns. The professionalization of execution, the ritualization of death, the use of spectacular punishment to send messages, the gradual expansion of capital offenses as the state seeks more control, the mixing of legal justification with religious or ideological sanctification. These patterns appear in ancient Rome, in medieval England, in revolutionary France, in modern America. The specifics differ, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Death becomes a tool of governance, a way of demonstrating that the state has ultimate power over citizens. The Vikings didn't invent this, but they perfected a particular version of it, a version that emphasized public ritual, professional execution, and the absolute nature of state authority. And they brought that version to Russia, where it found uniquely fertile ground. Let's return to Ibn Fadlan for a moment. Why does his account matter so much? Why do we keep coming back to his words written over 1,000 years ago? Because he was an outsider. He came from a sophisticated civilization, from Baghdad at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. He'd seen wealth, power, cultural achievement. He'd witnessed executions in his own society. Islamic law prescribed capital punishment for certain crimes. But what he saw on the Volga shocked him, not just because of the brutality. He'd seen brutality before, but because of the systematization, the ritual precision, the way death was choreographed and performed like theater, the way the community participated, celebrated even, in what struck him as fundamentally horrific. Ibn Fadlan gives us a window into how strange the Viking Rus approach to death really was, how it differed from other medieval societies, even brutal ones, how it created something unique that would persist in Russian culture. And his shock, his carefully documented horror, reminds us that none of this is natural or inevitable. Societies make choices about how to handle death and punishment. The Vikings made specific choices, brought those choices to Russia, and created a tradition. But traditions can be changed, can be ended. So where does this leave modern Russia? The moratorium on executions has held since 1996, nearly 3 decades, without a state execution. That's longer than many nations went before abolishing capital punishment entirely. There are young Russians who have never lived in a country that executed people, but the death penalty remains in the law books. And more significantly, the mentality that supports it, the belief in the state's absolute authority, the subordination of individual rights to collective needs, the use of fear as a tool of governance, this mentality persists. You see it in the laws restricting free speech in the name of protecting society from extremism. You see it in the treatment of political opposition as treason. You see it in the casual violence that characterizes so much of the relationship between Russian citizens and their state. The architecture of fear that the Viking Rus built doesn't require actual executions to function. It just requires the threat, the possibility, the understanding that the state could kill you if it decided to. The empty execution chamber is sometimes more powerful than the filled one, because it makes every citizen complicit in imagining what might happen there. What can we learn from this 1,000-year story? What does the Viking creation of Russia's death penalty tradition teach us? First, that ideas about power and death, once embedded in a culture, are extraordinarily difficult to remove. They persist across regime changes, across ideological transformations, across centuries. The Vikings brought a specific understanding of the state's relationship to death, and that understanding is still shaping Russian politics today. Second, that the professionalization and ritualization of death, the transformation of killing into a bureaucratic function, makes atrocities possible. When death becomes a job, when it follows procedures and protocols, ordinary people can commit extraordinary horrors while believing they're simply doing their duty. The angel of death wasn't a monster. She was a professional. That's what made her dangerous. Third, that the death penalty is never just about punishing criminals. It's always also about demonstrating power, maintaining hierarchy, controlling populations through fear. The specific crime being punished is almost secondary to the message being sent. The state has the power to kill you, and will use it if you step out of line. And finally, perhaps most importantly, that history is not destiny. Russia chose to sign Protocol No. 6. Russian citizens have debated, protested, argued for and against capital punishment. The tradition is powerful, but it's not inevitable. Think about the slave girl one more time. We don't know her name, but she's not anonymous anymore. Millions of people have read about her, thought about her, been horrified by her fate. She's become a symbol of how human beings can be reduced to instruments of ritual, of how death can be systematized and sanctified, of how power operates through the control of life and death. But she's also a reminder that every execution, every state killing, every use of death as a tool of governance involves a human being, someone with a name, a history, dreams that will never be fulfilled, people who mourn their loss. The Vikings who burned that chieftain on his ship thought they were honoring him, giving him what he needed for the afterlife. The girl thought she was entering paradise. The angel of death thought she was performing a sacred duty. And Ibn Fadlan thought he was documenting a barbarian ritual from a backward people. Who was right? What was the meaning of what happened that day in 921 A.D.? Maybe the point is that there is no single meaning. That event, that ritual, that death, it means different things depending on where you stand, what you believe, what you need to justify or condemn. But what's undeniable is its legacy. What happened on the Volga didn't stay on the Volga. It spread. It evolved. It became institutionalized. It shaped how an empire thought about death for 1,000 years. As I write these words in 2025, the last execution in Russia was in 1996, a man named Sergei Golovkin, executed for a series of brutal murders. The executioner who carried out that final death penalty was a professional trained in the methods following procedure. He was, in a very real sense, the last angel of death in the tradition that began with the Vikings. What comes next? Will Russia finally ratify the protocol and join the rest of Europe in abolishing capital punishment? Or will the tradition reassert itself as it has so many times before? The answer may depend on whether Russians can finally break free from the mentality. The Vikings brought the belief that the state must have ultimate power over life and death, that some crimes can only be answered with execution, that fear must be the foundation of social order. Or perhaps the answer is that history never really ends, that the past doesn't die, that the Vikings who came to the Volga 1,100 years ago are still shaping Russia today, their legacy written not in stone, but in the architecture of fear they built, and that every generation must choose either to maintain or dismantle. The girl on the ship is still dying. The angel of death is still performing her ritual. And Ibn Fadlan is still watching, still documenting, still shocked by what he sees. And we're still reading his words, still trying to understand what they mean, still grappling with the dark legacy of how Vikings created Russia's death penalty, a legacy that refuses to become history, that insists on remaining present, that demands we ask ourselves, how do we break a pattern that has endured for 1,000 years? Maybe that's the real question this story asks. Not how did Vikings create Russia's death penalty, but how do we finally end what they began? The answer, if there is one, won't be found in the past. It will be found in the choices people make today, in the courage to say no to the architecture of fear, in the willingness to imagine a different relationship between state and citizen, between power and death, between collective needs and individual dignity. The Vikings gave Russia a tradition, but every tradition is maintained by the living. And what the living maintain, the living can also end, if they choose